Okay, hello everyone. So this is the second part of the lecture. I promise to be shorter this time, and it is going to be sort of shorter. So what I'm going to cover in this section is how, especially things that you might want to consider when you're working with pre-existing visual materials from archives or personal collection, especially when it comes to using these sources to complement oral historical projects. So why is this something that is useful? Is perhaps we can start by getting you to think about how oral history and photography intersect at some level on a number of epistemic points. When I use the word epistemic, meaning that to put it simply, epistemology are sort of like knowledge systems, and it's really the sort of like knowledge that we have built around what we understand oral history to be and what we understand photography to be. So our knowledge of oral history and our knowledge of photography on many levels overlap, and principally on three areas, in that they often serve as some kind of evidence for historical research. Uh, they are also contained within them also an interest to understand what memory is. And last but not least, they intersect with one another on the point that both of them are especially powerful vehicles for storytelling, right? So very often you can think of them as being used as forms of evidence in historical research, and this requires some kind of memory work, meaning that it brings those people who are engaging with this material into a process where you're trying to recall uh, what we understand the past to be. And this process of recalling results in a narrative that is called a story, right? So in this case, perhaps what is worth remembering is that uh, even when we don't think of using, say, a photograph in our oral history project, in our oral history interview, whenever someone tries to tell or recall a story of the past, we often think of narrative through imagery, right? Remember a tree, remember a particularly vivid visual feature. And this helps us to anchor our story. It helps us to remember certain things. It adds certain sort of like color and detail uh, to the story that we want to tell to other people. Uh, Similarly, uh, in that way, I think there's something about the visual dimension that is more impressionable, that conveys information a lot more easily from one person to another person, and that's why imagery plays such a huge component within storytelling itself. At the same time, I think even when we sort of like look at a photograph, and we will not rely on textual captions or information to tell us what the image is all about, every time we look at an image, we cannot help but wonder what is the story behind it. It's not solely just an image, it's also the kind of like story that gives meaning to the image itself, right? So on many levels, I see this as an indication that perhaps we should really sort of like bring these two sort of like uh, approach of understanding and studying our past a lot sort of like closer to one another, right? These two sort of like sources into sort of like closer conversation. So how do we sort of like do that? Typically, when we sort of work with pre-existing visual materials from the archives or personal sort of like collection, we will need to sort of like consider a number of things. And I've sort of like structured today's this particular sort of like section into three areas that three things I want to sort of address. Okay, the first is really touching on the changing nature of oral history in the digital age. The second is to look at how photographs can help us to visualize the past, and I guess why archival photographs or personal photographs are perhaps important or useful, or even and beyond photograph, objects and sort of like sites are or buildings are actually sort of like useful to help us to give us a sense of what it was like. You know, nothing communicates understanding better than immersion, to give you a sense of that feeling. We often forget we feel more than we understand something better when we feel our way through it rather than think through it, you know. So using all these sort of like objects and images, they provide a different kind of like sensorial sort of like understanding of the past that is very that offers us an opportunity to understand understand history on different sort of like levels. And finally, I think visual forms and images offer us interesting interpretive sort of like frames to understand how people sort of like engage or work or use or live with visual forms and objects. And they're not all sort of like similar. So photography is something that, for example, is invented in France, right? And you might very often sort of like consider it as a European or Western sort of like invention. But as it sort of like traveled or it's sort of like circulated in different parts of the world, it intersects with local belief systems, with local worldviews, that brings into the use of photography different local interpretive frames. I try not to use the word local knowledge, which seems to suggest something sort of like more exclusive. That's a common term that people like to use, this local knowledge system, meaning that it's something that is already established, and it is a sort of like, it is a type of like knowledge that is unique to a particular point in time. But I think interpretation, the word interpretive here suggests something that is more active. It is a process of trying to understand something else. So when I use the word local interpretive frames, I'm suggesting that at any point in time when we look at cultural sort of like phenomena of objects, interpretation sort of like not only plays a key role, but that we should really think of the knowledge that we create as something that is actively being sort of like produced over and over again. And it's something that is requires us to sort of like pay attention to the specific context of its production. So this is all a bit vague, but I'm going to draw out examples and we're going to sort of like talk through some examples in a bit, okay? So first start with the changing nature of oral history in the digital age. Now I've got some sort of like, I should have sort of like cleaned up this page, but you would have already known out there on the internet, there's so many different kinds of oral history guidebooks that you can lean on or consult or refer to if you want to understand what are some of the best practices that are out there. Of course, these are guidebooks and they offer guidelines. They are not formulas. They don't guarantee direct results. After all, one particular method that works particularly well in one cultural context might not have considered the various kinds of cultural variables within our society that you might need to sort of like consider and respond to. And therefore requiring you to actually make some tweaking and adjustment to what is being sort of like recommended as a set of practices, best practices, okay? So always read these guidelines with a critical mind, with a willingness and openness to sort of like engage with the guidelines that are proposed or how you're supposed to sort of like do things. When I say critical, I don't mean sort of like cynical. What it actually means like to engage sort of with an open sort of like mind so that we can learn from each other through this sort of process, right? But beyond, I guess, learning how to actually do oral history, uh, and responding specifically to a whole new sort of like genre of literature, specifically targeting on how you can actually do remote oral history interviews during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think there are also other things about oral history uh, and the sort of like changes that it's undergoing in the digital age that maybe we should pay attention to. The first thing is that uh, very, very often we participate, but and then we forget, and we don't pay enough attention to social media streams. So a lot of Facebook groups, a lot of like heritage Facebook pages and groups and Twitter are very interesting sort of like avenues where oral history comes alive. I know it's in textual form, but really when you think about it, they're forms of sort of like oral history. So many sort of like stories that are sort of like traded, shared, uh, and discussed in these sort of like platforms in a very sort of like informal manner. And I think we, in trying to recognize an expanded sort of like understanding of oral history as a methodology, we should also sort of like look at the conversation that goes on in these groups and pages as fertile sort of and meaningful and actually very useful kind of like sources that can also complement what you're trying to do in your research as you apply uh, oral history, conventional oral historical sort of like interview method to understand your research project, okay? So one thing to look out for are the social media kind of streams or groups and look out for stories in there uh, 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 that sort of like, shed light on the topic that you're working on uh, that, that might not be conveyed to you in other sort of like platforms. Okay. The second thing to maybe think about is that there is now an opportunity to digitally access a growing public repository of oral historical recordings. Now, I'm always curious, everyone's doing oral history. Who actually goes and listen to oral history recordings? It's fun to sort of like do the talking, to do the interviewing and stuff like that. But is it also something that is built on existing knowledge? And I think here now, if in the past, it's very difficult to access these recordings, it might be sort of like locked up somewhere in the library or in some sort of like, a study institute that tends to be not very friendly to, say, researchers. All these things are being sort of like taken down when number of these recordings are sort of like shared online, right? And one of the best sort of like place to, I guess, find materials with context that we are actually very familiar with is the Oral History Center and the Oral History sort of like interview archives of the National Archives of Singapore that you see up here. The link is up here on the screen. So you just type Oral History interview, National Archive of Singapore. You should be able, the link should come up on Google, and just go and have a look at what constitutes an oral historical repository in the digital age. What kind of information do you put out there to help people retrieve this data or information that you've done? Think, when you think about oral history, it's also hours and hours and hours of talking. How do you make this information searchable to a public? So it's one thing to do the sort of like recording and get a kick out of it for yourself, but part of producing some kind of historical record is also to make this historical record as publicly accessible as possible to a whole wide range of people. And thinking about what are the digital tools available to facilitate this public accessibility is increasingly becoming very important. Yeah, so again, the third point here really just reinforced the fact that, you know, when we think of including textual documents that has an oral dimension as historical sources, I'm referring really to also like all these sort of Facebook groups, pages, or even sort of like projects done by other people, such as, for example, the May 13 stories done by Malaysia Kini. There are many different, it's already been published. There's a textual sort of like source. You know that it's there. Be aware of the field that you're looking at. Make sure you do, you understand how your work can really add depth to to a topic that is already in existence. So who are the other scholars that have worked on this topic? How have they sort of like, you know, approach this topic? If they also did sort of like oral history interview, how do you think your approach to oral history can maybe reveal new dimensions to how we understand about, say, for example, May 13? You might then be forced to then think more critically and also think harder about actually what do you need to then sort of like experiment with, what do you need to explore in terms of how you conduct your interview that might allow your interview subjects to actually sort of like share things or communicate their understanding of this past in a different manner that might offer new ways for us to understand this sort of like period of history. So now all this said and done, this is perhaps I think things that you can actually discuss further in class. I understand that all of you will be working towards a project, and given that on one level there's an interest in producing, you know, something more tangible and physical, but increasingly living in the digital age. And given that we're separated by each other by this sort of like the distance due to the pandemic, creating digital resources that have a wider reach and has greater accessibility has become increasingly sort of like important, and thinking of what are the technologies available to help us achieve that is also equally important. Okay, so the next section I want to touch on is that, you know, when we work with sort of like photographs, historical photographs, we don't only sort of like bring them into interviews. Sometimes we use photographs alongside oral history, meaning that your oral history sort of like interview itself might not incorporate, might not be a session where you bring in photographs to discuss with your interview subjects. Rather, instead, what you use the photograph. Rather, the whole in this section, what I'm discussing is that, so after you've conducted, say, your oral history interview, there are certain sort of like points you want sort of clarification on, or you feel like it has prompted you to want to learn more about certain things. Say, for example, I want to understand, you know, the person in the interview mentioned about how Malacca might look like in the 1950s. So from the point of view of, say, rickshaw puller, right? A beca, sort of like rickshaw puller, a Sanunsa sort of like rider. So how do you then sort of like, and wanting to maybe sort of like understand what is the sort of like environment of this rickshaw puller a bit better, you might want to sort of like think of building up a sort of like collection of a photographic sort of like collection that can help you to picture Malacca in the 1950s. As James Warren in his sort of like article, Social History and the Photograph says, you know, a thoughtful analysis of still photographs can provide compelling information on a decisive moment in time and reveal in the process something about the behavior, the physical details, and the characteristic environment. In this context, the image of these still photos, this moment rather than that, are a means to outwit time. What the last sentence suggests is that perhaps when you go to Malacca today, you know, other than that few becak riders who still circles around, say, A Formosa, this particular sort of like trade, this particular sort of like labor is no longer visible. It's no longer present. It doesn't register in the city anymore. And James Warren has very strong reasons to say this because, you know, he's known for his research on two of the most sort of like invisible laboring class in Singapore's history, right? Those of you who have read Rickshaw Coolie, Rickshaw Puller, Coolie Rickshaw Puller will know that that was his sort of like first book on people who used to sort of like pull rickshaws and trying to sort of like use large amount of sort of like data, especially coroner's report, meaning these are reports written by someone who is there to certify your death. And it is through interviewing the various sort of like friends and friends of like all the rickshaw pullers, they're able to sort of like confirm that he died in a certain sort of like way. And these deaths are often sort of like horrifying and very graphic, right? And therefore using all these sort of like records, he's able to sort of piece together the life story, the entire sort of like life cycle stories of sort of like rickshaw puller. And he thinks that photographs has a very important role to play in that because it helps us to create certain kind of like empathic bond between subjects that even for us, even if our ancestors come from this particular laboring class, we have really no idea of what life was like. But photos offer that very powerful sort of like link, you know, for us to learn how to empathize. He then go on and, you know, produce a second book looking at both Chinese and Japanese prostitutes during the same time, during the colonial period in Singapore, also using similar sort of like method. And I think this book is worth reading only because the second book is worth reading for you only because it actually uses a lot more oral historical interviews in them as well. I think not both produced, maybe not produced by him, but at least those that are recorded by different people over time, and how even if you are only interested in becoming a documenter, you might want to sort of like read this to understand how the record that you produce in the future how can it be useful to other people, to other researchers, to other historians who might access your record and draw out something useful in that story so that he's able to sort of like, he or she might be able to sort of like produce something meaningful, a larger sort of like story out of it. So these are things that is particularly useful when it comes to sort of like the use of photograph to help us to understand this past, right? And on some level, I think it's worth sort of like remembering that as we sort of like go through old photographs, I think there are various sort of like steps for us to get a better sort of understanding of what the photograph is. So typically, this is in art history, we call this process visual analysis. So in trying to do visual analysis, there are a number of things that is worth sort of like doing. I will talk about one strategy first, which is to try to read these photographs as what James Warren calls a thoughtful analysis, right? What constitutes a thoughtful analysis that might provide compelling information. Okay, and later on in the next lecture, I will suggest a different sort of like method that is more creative. Okay, so for this particular section, perhaps when you look at a photograph like that, if you don't even have any details of the photograph, and I'm being very intentional here, not to sort of like give you any captions or stuff like that, is that you have to start asking yourself, what can I gain from something that you have no other information about? Okay. The first thing you might want to do is to start identifying what are the basic details in the photograph. What do you think it's trying to sort of like say? And it's worth at this point trying to sort of like make notes of what you're seeing. So it involves often identifying very basic sort of like details. And you should sort of try to articulate what you're seeing in descriptive form. So typically, so here, for example, what I notice immediately is there's a man in a sort of like colonial, in a bush jacket, wearing a white bush jacket, button-up white bush jacket, with sort of like a cowboy, a felt hat on or something like that, carrying what seems like an old camera and posing on the street towards the camera. And so you can even go into your impression of this person. So I might read from his expression that he is someone who seems confident. But don't stop there at just describing him as confident. You have to give explanation why you think so. Okay, so this I think is suggested, for example, by the way he's standing. One leg is slightly sort of bent while he's resting his entire body weight on his second leg. And this shows that, he is posing and he's for the camera, and shows that he's aware of the camera. But I also noticed that his eyes are directed towards his eyes doesn't seem like he's looking directly to the camera. It seems like he's looking sideways. So all these things that don't always sort of like come together as a neat narrative, you should sort of like write them down. What else is there? So there's that central sort of character, but I also got a sense that on the right there is the rickshaw. At the back of the rickshaw, we can see, a back of the rickshaw on his left side, and at the back, almost like an Indian, as suggested by his dark skin, possibly an Indian laborer, hand carting a bullock, pulling a hand cart in the middle of the road. Surrounding him are then all these sort of buildings that seem to be sort of coming up as if they're still under sort of like construction, as suggested by this particular building over here, where it almost seems that the scaffold of the building has not yet been sort of like removed. Okay, so by describing all these sort of like identifying all these details, by describing all these things, you might then be able to make certain inferences about what the photograph is about. Why do you think the person took this photograph, right? So based on the centrality of this figure here, I might surmise that, it's primarily a sort of like self-portrait, projecting subject as someone who is sort of like confident, but he's not only confident, he embraces, modern technology. He's not only willing to be photographed, but he himself is holding a camera, and he wants to identify himself as someone who knows how to sort of like take photo, right? Who knows how to use the camera, who's able to sort of like to embrace all these sort of like new technology that's coming out from different parts of the world. The clothes that he's wearing is clearly sort of like European, and so therefore he's also in some ways trying to show that he identifies himself with European culture. So given the centrality of his figure in the photograph, we might be able to say that this is the principal sort of like message that the photograph is trying to sort of say. Uh, 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 that the photograph is taken so that we get to see this young, presumably Baba person, Perhatikan person, trying to sort of like project himself as very worldly, very cosmopolitan, and someone who is not afraid to sort of like embrace new things. He is himself staging his own modernity, so to speak. Okay, but at the same time, I think we also need to recognize there are multiple sort of like meanings in a photograph. Right? That reading that I've just proposed is in fact the main reading that would that made the curators of the Peranakan Museum, the guest curators at the Peranakan Museum in Singapore, choose this image as one of the publicity image lah. So the exhibition is called like Ambil Gambar or Ambil Gambar in the Peranakan sort of slang, right? And it's about sort of like Peranakan engagement with photography, and the curators frame it as a kind of embrace of new technology, as a willingness to be part of the modern world, and the way they photograph and accept the camera as a sort of like technology, as well as the willingness to be sort of like photographed, shows that they participate actively in the modern sort of like project, and in trying to identify themselves as modern subjects, right? The modern people. So that's one way of sort of like, reading a photograph. But, photographs are very slippery things, and that, and like it or not, it also contains other details that might move us to consider other things. And here, I think, the French culture theorist Roland Barthes idea of, the punctum and the studium is perhaps worth thinking about. So when he talks about the studium, it's really what he means is this is something that, like what I've just sort of like described to you, it's the main message of the sort of like photograph, the thing that that you can that is most immediately readable or accessible as you look at a particular image. And it's also likely what the image is intended for, right? So the person taking the photograph will be either a friend or family member of this person you see in the picture over here. And therefore he will be taking a photo to help his friend fulfill that image that he wants to present to the world. So there's a kind of like consistency with the main message of what the photograph is there to do. However, when we think of a photograph's punctum, and this word is taken from, I guess, Latin, and it comes to mean a kind of like prick, meaning that you prick something on your skin and blood might sort of like come out, or a kind of wounding, right, a scarring itself. And these are sort of like details in a photograph. As you look and dwell at a photograph a bit longer, that will come out or leap out at you all of a sudden. And for me, looking at something like this, what it means, after staring at the picture for a very long time, what suddenly sort of like leaps out to me was this other person over here behind. And this punctum, while the studium is consistent, it's the main message, and generally everyone should be able to sort of like get it by looking at the photograph. And but punctum is a very personal sort of like experience of the photograph, and different people will have different kinds of like response based on your own life story, your experience and things like that. Others might find, I don't know, maybe coming from, a construction background, the scaffolding is particularly evocative of a family sort of like, involvement in the building trade. But as I was working on sort of like a project looking at sort of like Indian indentured laborers. At that time, immediately the figure of the working class Indian person pulling a cart became resonant. It became larger. It became much more sort of like forceful than this figure sort of like standing here. And therefore, the photograph itself becomes meaningful to me, not because of this person here, but because of this person here. And it could be, for example, I don't know, imagine, let's say, there might be a prostitute standing sort of like here, who might sort of like give you a different sort of like awareness of where she is located, how she's positioned within a sort of like city environment. And careful reading of all these old images is rewarding because of this. Typically, using this kind of approach, I would recommend spending at least sort of like half an hour, let's say, in today's sort of like context where everyone scrolls through an image in less than 2 seconds, maybe even half an hour or 20 minutes. You'll be surprised how much you are able to learn by just doing that patient and observation. So give it a try. I mean, this is an exercise that you can practice with any kind of material that you have. It's not just photograph. It can be objects. It can be things. And try to learn how to sort of like write details, description of the details. It might not you might not at first sort of form essays or full sentences about it. That's very clearly logical in terms of how you construct your argument, but it's important to sort of start with even like in point forms, write down what the details are, and then sort of see if you are able to sort of like connect those points and see how those descriptions actually contribute to understanding of what you're seeing. Important, as I mentioned just now, is that you always need to sort of like justify your interpretation. So when you say that he looks confident, how? Say what makes you think he looks confident in this particular photo. And that's the sort of really the gist of visual analysis. We can sort of like talk more if you want to when we meet in class, because this is also something that you need long-term sort of like training to master. Like how you read text or, understand, like say, how we interpret sentences in literature. It comes with practice. The more you practice, the better you get at it. Okay? So the last point I want to sort of like raise here is really being sensitive to local interpretive frames of visuality. And here I want to draw from Karen Strassler's book, Refracted Visions, looking at how photographs are sort of like being used or gaining sort of new meanings in Indonesia, right? And one of the examples that she draw on is this particularly crazy character who in 1979 started to receive like visions from sort of God, right? And he's a very active sort of like participant in all these nationalist organization. And in one of those rallies, a photograph that was taken of his on his head, because of because of optics or whatever, there appeared that there is this sort of like pentagram, like shape, sort of like a light orb above his head, and he took that and interpreted that as some kind of like divine calling, and recognizing these 5 points as corresponding to the Pancasila, which is the Indonesia version of Rukun Negara. And he describes this as a kind of bukti authentic, that he's been sort of like blessed. He's been sort of authenticated as a copy of Sukarno, and therefore should be the rightful successor of the Indonesian presidency, as opposed to, you know, then sort of like President Suharto, who he calls a false sort of copy. And so in his homes, as Karen Strassky sort of like describes in the book, you know, every single sort of like wall space is covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, posters, painted figures. And, you know, it's some images are sort of like stuck onto other things, you know. There's also lithographic sort of like images of like religious figures. And then there's also political figures, and there are also mythical and legendary sort of like figures. But all these sort of like Caplang mix, there are also a lot of family photographs. And these are studio portraits taken in the 50s that you see, I've shown you just now, right? Or even identity cards that are then sort of enlarged. So in a way, it's a very, to Karen Strassler, it's a very strange kind of like parody of the Javanese living room, where typically, and we can imagine this because the Chinese living room is also like this, where family photographs are typically displayed alongside various sort of political, cultural, and religious kind of like affiliation, except this time, it's making us aware of how strange and unique this cultural practice is that we take for granted as normal. But it takes someone to sort of like, you know, exaggerate it a little to see that, hey, actually, this way of displaying photograph is not natural. Not everyone in the world practice this way of sort of like showing family photographs at home, alongside all these other things, right? But actually, it's a sort of like culture. It belongs to cultural sort of practice. And there are local interpretive frames involved. It involves understanding photographs as some kind of evidence of our family's participation within larger social, historical institutions, whether they're part of like history, whether they're part of religion, whether they're part of like cultural, whether these are political, cultural, or religious. They show our sort of like connection to larger kinds of like institutions and bodies and ideas. And we show them in the front room because they are projection. We project this to people that that we want to build a relationship with, and this is almost like a certificate of who we think of our sense of sort of like belonging to the world. So discovering these local interpretive frames of visuality helps us to sort of like see how images themselves are used. And we cannot assume that everyone use image or understand the image in a similar way. So let's take one last example. And this is a good example because I think the contrast is so stark and so different that you should be able to sort of see this almost immediately. Now let's take a sort of like a typical European sort of like map, right? Where you have, this is a very early 18th century version, the sea, and this is a map of the Perak River. Sea sort of like coming into the bank, the river banks, and then it sort of like leads upstream and goes inland. Okay, so cartographically, as a map, it really sort of like lays out a geographic terrain, and then plots various sort of like coordinates so that we can we can sort of like abstract ourselves from our sort of like everyday surrounding and view and understand our landscape from a different sort of like perspective, from a vantage that allows us to sort of measure the distance between one particular point towards another particular point. Now, not all maps serve this purpose. So, for example, take this 19th century map that has survived. There are only very, very few Malay maps that have survived in the archive. This is the same Perak River map. If you want to measure distance between one point to another point, forget it. It's not going to help you sort of like do that. Nevertheless, if you want to understand the power relationship and how it is inscribed in the geography of the Perak River itself, then it's going to tell us so much more about that compared to this particular map here, which has no information and has no ability to capture that kind of information because it doesn't serve that sort of like purpose. Whereas this form of visualization, you get a sense of the nakoda, which is like the sultan, is at the center of this vast, fragmented network of competing sort of like power bases and interests, right? And each of the river branches is controlled by one orang kaya or one orang besar or some sort of like ulama, and you see them having some kind of like territorial sovereignty or some kind of like power over particular sort of streams along the Perak River. Of course, then the Sultan at the center sits at the center on the river. He is the trunk. So a visualization like this gives us a sense of power structure in the Malay world, and it's also challenged our common understanding of power structure, right? Typically, we tend to view it in the Western sort of like image of a pyramid, you know, Sultan at the top, and then like, you know, the orang kaya, and then the 8 orang kaya. Yes, maybe that's one good way to visualize hierarchy, but I think this is equally arresting, and it shows hierarchy as issuing out from a trunk, a central sort of like point where you have the king at the center. So in this way, it is closer to, you know, how a lot of political scientists have described Southeast Asia as having what is called a Mandala polity, meaning that depending your sort of like power and influence diminish as power and authority and prestige is defined through a concentric sort of like circle, meaning that it's circular, of diminishing sort of like importance. The further away from the center or the seat of authority that you are, the less sort of like importance and influence you have within this larger sort of like social institution, social and political institution. So rather than think of like the pyramidal sort of like top-down sort of like structure as the only way to visualize sort of like power, here it's suggesting that power can be thought of in terms of its centrality and periphery, what is at the center and what is at the outskirt, at the border. And therefore the borders themselves is something that is more porous. Today we know that the borders are fixed between Thailand and Malaysia. You go to a certain point, you cross this river, that is Thailand. But borders back then have a lot less sort of like defined. And because of this kind of like political sort of structure, and looking at and paying attention to these sort of like local interpretive frames and how they then inform visual expressions of these interpretive frames are important, because it then helps us to understand the context and the situation a lot better. Okay, thank you.